The major topic of this video will be a general philosophical question that we find in ethics and in political philosophy, namely, when should the government prevent harm? And we'll use the question of a prohibition on drug use as an example in order to explore this question. So I therefore want to offer a caveat at the top that this presentation doesn't try to deal with the question of drug use or drug sales in an exhaustive way. We're just going to look at a couple arguments in order to consider the question of whether the government should be in the business of preventing us from harming ourselves or harming others. All right, so we're going to talk about prohibition on drug use, and so we need to get clear on the terms. Prohibition is just a law which would prevent drug use or drug possession. That's a distinct question from the permissibility of drug sales. So we can imagine a world where a government punishes the production and sale of drugs, but doesn't punish the use or possession of drugs and treats them as distinct under the law. We're going to be focusing specifically on drug use, not on drug production or sale. When we say the word drug, what we're going to be referring to is something like illicit drugs, so currently illegal drugs, and we'll take maybe as paradigmatic examples of drugs for this video, things like cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. We could also include under this banner cannabis, since there is still an ongoing debate in the United States about cannabis. Some states legalize it, others don't. There are various questions about its health benefits versus its health risks, so we can include that in our debate here. So regarding the question of whether there should be a prohibition on drug use, we see that there are three broad categories of arguments in favor of it. So the first is self-harm. This argument says, look, drug use involves a kind of self-harm, and so we should prevent citizens from doing it. So the self-harm is harm to the user, him or herself. And this could involve a physical symptom or physical damage or cognitive damage or another kind of harm to the self. This is distinct from the second category, harm to others. This kind of argument is going to focus on the fact that drug use often harms not just the individual who uses drugs, but those around them, like their friends or family, or their coworkers, or their fellow citizens. And then a third kind of argument focuses on the related activities that are often associated with drug use and says, look, drug use often is correlated with these other illegal or violent behaviors, so we have a strong reason to prevent drug use. All right, so Huemer is going to engage in this discussion. The discussion both of the extent to which governments should prevent harm and the question of the permissibility of a prohibition on drug use. And he's going to argue against a prohibition on drugs. He's going to do it two ways. First, he's going to consider the two major reasons cited for prohibiting drug use, namely that drugs involve self-harm and that drug use harms citizens other than drug users. So he's going to combat both of those arguments. He's going to try to show that those aren't good arguments for prohibiting drug use. And then once he's done so, once he's tackled the arguments against legalizing drugs, arguments in favor of punishing drugs and drug use, he's going to make a positive argument in favor of legalizing drugs based on the notion of rights. So he's going to say that a prohibition on drug use is unethical because it violates some of our most basic rights. All right, let's look at his arguments. So drugs and self-harm. Although there is some controversy regarding which drugs are harmful and which are beneficial, like that is a debate that society is having right now about cannabis or about certain psychedelic drugs, there is no doubt that at least some currently illegal drugs are very harmful. So there's just no doubt that heroin, for example, causes physical harm, mental harm, and various other kinds of harm. Not only because of what the drug does, but also because of the withdrawal process. So it's impossible to deny that at least some drug use involves self-harm. In other words, harm to the user, him or her, or their self. So the crucial question is whether the government is ever justified in preventing self-harm. This is the question of government paternalism. You can think of government paternalism as the government acting like a parent in order to prevent citizens from harming themselves. We do think, in ordinary cases, that parents are justified in preventing their children from harming themselves, and we think this on the grounds that the children don't know better, so it's therefore the responsibility of the parents to prevent the harm. The question is the government ever in a similar position, such that it can be justified in preventing citizens from harming themselves? Or do we have specific liberties or freedoms that would make such interference in our lives unjustified? So if the government is at least sometimes justified in preventing self-harm, we then have the second question. Is it justified in preventing the self-harm caused by drug use? In other words, if we think government paternalism is in some instances justified, is the prohibition on drugs because of the self-harm involved an instance of permissible or justified government paternalism? So Huemer's going to present us with the basic argument in favor of government paternalism about this. The idea that governments can, in some instances, be justified in preventing self-harm. And that drug use is one of those justified instances. The argument looks very simple. Premise 1 says drug use is very harmful to users. So this is just an empirical matter. Either drug use is or isn't harmful, and we might want to break down and look at each individual drug, of course. Argument 2 says premise 2 says the government should prohibit people from doing things that are harmful to themselves. This, I think, is the substantial philosophical premise because it has to do with if and when the government should prevent people from doing things that harm themselves. This is a question about the extent of political power. What I want you to see is that if premise 1 is true and if premise 2 is true, then the conclusion must follow. In other words, this argument is structured very nicely. If 1 is true, and 2 is true, then 3 must necessarily follow. So the analysis here needs to be on the premises. Now, we could continue to focus our attention on premise 1 and do some empirical work, but we should reflect on the question, is the government justified in prohibiting people from doing things that harm themselves? So pause the video there and just reflect on that. Can the government interfere on individuals in order to prevent them from harming themselves? Do we think that that's right? So the first premise is going to be evaluated by the relevant sciences. So if we want to explore that premise, we're going to look at toxicology reports. We're going to talk to psychologists. We're going to look at image scans of brains. The second premise is a premise that evaluates judgments about legitimate political authority. That's going to be our crucial premise. So if it's the case that we don't think the proper role of government is to prevent self-harm, then premise 2 would be false and the argument fails. So this argument is going to crucially hinge on the success or the truth value of premise 2. All right, for Huemer, premise 2 is implausible. Here's his crucial quote about premise 2. He says, premise 2, if taken without qualification, is extremely implausible. Consider some examples of things people do that are harmful or entail a risk of harm to themselves. Smoking tobacco, drinking alcohol, eating too much, riding motorcycles, having unprotected or promiscuous sex, maintaining relationships with inconsiderate or abusive boyfriends or girlfriends, maxing out their credit cards, working in dead-end jobs, dropping out of college, moving to New Jersey, and being rude to bosses. Should the government prohibit all of these things? So why don't you pause again and reflect. Are these things the government should prohibit? Here's Huemer's answer. Most of us would agree that the government should not prohibit any of these things, let alone all of them. This is not merely for logistical reasons. Rather, we think that controlling these activities is not the business of the government. So we think if you're going to evaluate the success of Huemer's argument, you need to think about whether he's right that the government shouldn't prohibit any of these things. And that's maybe an ethical judgment that you would need to arrive at and then defend. What I want to point out is that he says we shouldn't prohibit them merely for logistical reasons, which is to say, it's not for practical reasons that we shouldn't do it. Logistical or practical reasons would be things like, how do we stop people from having promiscuous sex? Or how do we stop people from eating too much? What would that mean? What would that require of the government? That would require a lot of effort and invasion and constantly monitoring people. That wouldn't be practical. He's not pointing to practical reasons here. He's going to point to reasons having to do with principle. He thinks it would be unprincipled or unethical. That's what he means when he says we're not in the business of doing that. Okay, so how could someone who wishes to prohibit drug use respond to this argument in at least a few ways? So in other words, how could they defend premise 2 from Huemer's counter-argument? First, they might argue that what justifies a prohibition on drug use is that it also harms citizens other than drug users. So we'll turn back to this possibility later, because Huemer discusses it later in his paper. Second, they might argue that drug use is more harmful than other activities listed. So maybe drug use is more harmful than alcohol or tobacco or promiscuous sex or maxing out debit cards. Third, they might argue that drug use is uniquely harmful, that it involves particular kinds of harms. All right, so we're going to turn to this second and third kind of argument. The second argument being that drug use is more harmful, and the third argument which says that drug use is uniquely harmful, so entails specific kinds of harms other activities don't entail. But is drug use more harmful? Supposing that drug use is more harmful than other activities we're allowed to do, this might provide a good justification for a prohibition on drug use. But Huemer thinks this argument fails on statistical grounds. He notes, for example, that tobacco use and obesity kill more people on average than illicit drugs. So he thinks just if you look at the statistics, drug use, illicit drug use, is not killing as many people as obesity and tobacco use, for example. So this would be a counter-argument to the idea that drug use is more harmful. Here I just want to offer the caveat that Huemer's paper was written before the opioid crisis, so deaths due to drug use have certainly increased, although opioids are not strictly the kinds of drugs this paper is about, because opioids are prescribed, so they're not punishable by law if one gets them through a legal route, and you just can't get heroin through a legal route, so it's a conceptually different kind of drug. Rather than trying to compare illness and death caused by illicit drugs with other activities, a prohibitionist might instead argue that drug use causes specific kinds of harms. So, for example, the use of illicit drugs might harm important relationships. All right, here's where Huemer's going to make his important argument about government paternalism. So, in other words, here is his crucial claims about whether or not the government preventing us from harming ourselves is justified. So let's consider this idea that illicit drug use might harm important relationships, and this might be a unique harm that drug use causes. Huemer replies to this concern by noting that there are many other activities which more directly harm relationships. He writes, being rude to others can also have this effect, yet no one believes you should be put in jail for being rude. In other words, if it's bad to harm your relationships, then there are some activities which directly harm relationships. They do so more directly than drug use. So, if we're going to prohibit any activity which harms relationships, there will be some which should be prohibited before drug use. He goes on, suppose that I break up with my girlfriend, stop calling my family, and push away all my friends. I do this for no good reason. I just feel like it. This would damage my personal relationships as much as anything could. Should the police now come and arrest me and put me in jail? Using this logic, he establishes his reasonable political principle. This is his crucial idea about paternalism. If it would be wrong, because not part of the government's legitimate functions, to punish people for directly bringing about some results, it would also be wrong to punish people for doing something other action on the grounds that the action has a chance of bringing about that result indirectly. So if it would be bad to punish someone for doing something which directly brings about some results, like, for example, throwing all their money out the window and maxing out their credit cards, which would directly bring about financial harm, then it would be wrong to punish people for doing something like using drugs on the grounds that drug use makes it more likely that we will fail financially. So since we don't want to punish people for directly doing these specific activities, activities which end relationships or ruin relationships, or activities which ruin our financial lives, since we don't want to punish people for doing activities which have those direct results, it doesn't make any sense to punish people for using drugs merely on the grounds that it increases by some percentage the chance that we will, in fact, bring about those results. This is his reasonable political principle. In general, prohibitionist arguments that emphasize self-harm caused by drug use are more controversial than arguments that emphasize harm to others. In other words, when we think about the legitimate function of government, the legitimate extent of political power, we typically think that government does play an important role in preventing citizens from harming each other. This is what the police is for. We do think that that's a legitimate use of force, at least in many instances. So maybe it's important to pivot away from self-harm to harm to others. Because when we're trying to prevent self-harm, there's a major risk that the government is violating our freedoms or our individual liberties to do what we want. But since we don't have liberties and freedoms to do any old thing to other people, then the harm that drug use entails on other people might be a more legitimate target or reason for prohibiting drug use. So the question would be, is it the harm to others that justifies a prohibition on drug use? Huemer does agree that at least some harms to others caused by drug use ought to be prevented. For example, he agrees that driving while under the influence of drugs is worthy of regulation and punishment because that will involve harm to others in a very direct way. But does other kinds of harms to others justify a prohibition on drugs? So, are there other kinds of ways that drug use harms other people that would provide us reason or justification for prohibiting drugs? So Huemer here is going to employ a similar argumentative strategy. So this is going to be structurally similar to his previous strategy. He says, imagine this character named Howard. Here's his characterization of Howard. He constantly blames other people for his problems and tries to avoid making decisions. Howard is a college student with a part-time job. However, he is a terrible student and worker. He hardly ever studies and frequently misses assignments. And as a result, he gets poor grades. As we mentioned earlier, Howard comes to work late and takes no pride in his work. Though he does nothing against our current laws, he is an inattentive and inconsiderate spouse and parent. Nor does he make any effort to participate in the life of his community or the promise of America. Should Congress pass laws against what Howard is doing? Okay, so here Huemer is characterizing someone who regularly harms others in various direct ways. For example, he's inattentive to his role as a parent. He's not a good worker. He doesn't care about his political community. So he is directly harmful of others. Should Howard be punished for being the way he is? Should we make laws which prevent people from being like Howard? Seems like we wouldn't. I think that's the intuition Huemer wants us to have, that it would be wrong to punish people for having certain behavioral qualities as such, especially when those behavioral qualities don't themselves violate any laws. So here's the general structure of this argument regarding drugs and harm to others. So premise 1, drug use increases the chance that the user harms others. I think Huemer agrees with this. Some drug use does entail certain harms because some kinds of drugs make it that people are less attentive to their relationships. But premise 2 says other activities directly harm others. So drug use increases the chance of those harms, but other activities do it directly. So drug use might increase the likelihood that I ruin my relationship, but breaking up with my girlfriend for no reason at all would definitely ruin my relationship, he says. If harming others is bad, this is premise 3, then activities which directly harm others are worse than activities which only increase the chance of harm to others. So in other words, if we really are concerned with harm to others, then the things which directly harm others are going to be worse than those things which just make it a little bit more likely that will harm others. And it would then follow premise 4, If activities which directly harm others are worse than activities which only increase the chance of harm to others, then activities which directly harm others should be punished before activities which only increase the chance of harm to others. That's a mouthful. Here the idea is, if it really is the case that activities which directly harm others are worse, then if we're going to punish any activities, it should be those activities which are worse. And those would be those which directly harm, not those which only increase the likelihood of harm. But, he says, premise 5, don't wish to punish many of the activities which directly harm others. So, many of the activities which directly harm others are things which it would be weird and unethical to punish. It would be weird to punish someone for giving all their money away to strangers, or maxing out their credit card, or throwing their money out the window, or breaking up with their girlfriend, or deciding they don't want to have a relationship with their parents anymore. Those would be activities which directly harm others, or harm themselves, or both. Since we don't want to punish those kinds of activities, it would be impermissible to punish any activity which only increases the chance of harm to others. So therefore, it would be impermissible to punish drug use on the grounds that it merely increases the chance of harm to others, since we don't want to punish for activities that directly bring about harm to some others. Okay. This is Huemer's crucial argument, and here I want you to really pause and read through these steps a couple times, because there's many steps he's taking here in order to get us to the conclusion that it would be impermissible to punish drug use. So pause, take a look at it, take a look at the structure, evaluate each of the premises, see how they are strung together, and see if you think that this argument holds. In other words, whether it really does support the conclusion. All right. Finally, he's going to make a different kind of argument in favor of legalizing drugs. So moving beyond these arguments in favor of a prohibition, Huemer's going to argue that a prohibition on drug use is unethical because it violates our basic rights. Huemer argues that we have a general and fundamental right to do what we want with our bodies. So we have this general right to do what we want, to move about the world, to do things that we want to our bodies, to get tattoos, to work out, to eat unhealthy. These are all within the scope of our rights to do what we want with our bodies. He says that the right to do what we want with our bodies explains why we think that others may not physically attack or kidnap you. It explains why we do not accept the use of unwilling subjects for medical experiments, even if the experiments are beneficial to society. So here he's substantiating the claim that we have a right to do what we want with our bodies. He's going to use the argument that we have a right to do what we want with our bodies to support the idea that we have a right to use drugs, since that's just an example of doing something we want to do to our bodies. Okay, so he's going to argue, look, since we have a right to do what we want with our bodies, we have a right to use drugs. Prohibitions on drug use therefore violate our basic rights. Here's the last important philosophical piece of this paper that I want to cover. This is how a prohibitionist might respond to the idea that we have a right to use drugs because we have a right to do what we want with our bodies. They might counter by claiming that drug use is not protected by the right to do what we want with our bodies because drug use is not a free choice. So on this retort, the prohibitionist is pointing to the addictive nature of many illicit drugs. So they're going to point out, look, maybe we do have a right to do what we want with our bodies, but when people use drugs, they're not choosing to do something. They're responding to their addiction. So it's not a free choice. And since it's not a free choice, it's not an instance of them doing what they want with their bodies. So it's not protected by this general right to do what we want. Okay, here's Huemer's reply to that objection. He says, the prohibitionist faces a dilemma. If users do not freely choose to use drugs, then it is unjust to punish them for using drugs. For if users do not choose freely, then they are not morally responsible for this decision. And it is unjust to punish a person for something he is not responsible for. Okay, so the first part of this dilemma would be something like, look, if it really is the case that drug users don't freely use drugs, then it would be wrong to punish them. It would be wrong to punish them because we think we should only punish when people can do otherwise. In other words, if you can't avoid doing something, it doesn't make any sense to punish you for it because you couldn't have stopped yourself from doing it. We usually punish people for doing something as a result of their choices, not because they were made to do it. If addiction makes us use drugs, causes us to use drugs, then punishing us would be besides the point. It would be unethical. But if, on the other hand, users do freely choose to use drugs, then this really is an exercise of the right to do what they want. So in either case, it would be unethical. If they're addicted, then it would be unethical. And if they're not addicted, it would be unethical. If they're addicted, it would be unethical because they can't control it. They couldn't have done otherwise. And it's wrong to punish people when they can't do otherwise. But if they're not addicted, then they're exercising their free choice to do what they want with their bodies. And so that would also be unethical. All right, here's a review. Huemer considers two categories of arguments in favor of a prohibition on drugs. The first category was arguments that emphasize the self-harm of drug use. Regarding these harms, he argues that it's not a legitimate function of government to prevent self-harm. And he argues that based on the precedent set by all of the currently allowable activities that involve self-harm, things like drinking alcohol or using tobacco. Next, he focuses on arguments that emphasize harm to others. Regarding these arguments, he argues that since we're not interested in prohibiting many activities that directly harm others, like ending relationships, we shouldn't prohibit drug use merely because it makes it more likely that we will harm others. That's his reasonable political principle. And then finally, he's going to argue that a right to use drugs based on the general right to do what we want with our bodies is justified. So since we have a right to do what we want with our bodies, and since drug use involves doing something to our own bodies, a prohibition on drug use would be unjustified because it would be a violation of the right to do what we want with our bodies. Okay, so this video covered Huemer's paper, America's Unjust Drug War. I do recommend reading this paper in full as it involves a lot of important arguments, a lot of logical steps, which I've tried to cover in some detail here, but there are many other important arguments which you might find interesting. And I do think reading this paper will provide you reinforcement for understanding what has been covered in this presentation.